going to live stream.
Okay. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're live. Thank you guys so much for tuning in wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Hana Alasry. You might have seen me on previous lives. I am the founder of Salim Life Coaching, and our mission is to help Muslims to prepare for and enrich their marriage, as well as heal chronic childhood trauma. So today we are going to be focusing on the premarital preparation side of things. And the topic of today's live is topics you should discuss with a future spouse. So we are going to talk about why it's important to have these discussions, some rules for having these discussions, and what the actual discussions should be and why. So there's a quote that I came across recently, and I feel like it really exemplifies why it's so important to have particular discussions before committing to marrying someone. And the quote was, "There are no secrets to success. It is the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure." So when you get married, you don't want to just be married. Ideally, inshallah, you are working towards a successful marriage. And what is a successful marriage? A successful marriage is one that's healthy. It's one in which the spouses are supportive of each other, who love each other for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who are pushing each other towards getting better, who recognize what their responsibilities are towards each other, and they strive to fulfill those responsibilities. One huge part of a successful marriage is making sure that you're compatible with the person that you're marrying. And part of that is knowing the answers to certain questions about the person in all different aspects. And so the reason why these questions are having certain discussions about certain topics is important is because it's helping you to assess that compatibility. Oftentimes when we meet someone or we're introduced to someone, we might have blinders on. And so we might assume certain things about the person, and that's all fine and dandy until the assumption is found out to be not true. And the only way to figure out if those assumptions are not true is, again, by asking. Now, when you think back to the Prophet ﷺ's time, these premarital discussions that are a lot more common now were not common back then. And sometimes people would say things like, well, back during the Prophet ﷺ's time, people didn't have to have these long and extensive discussions. They didn't have to have all of these questions or go over so many different topics. Why do we need to do that now? And my answer to that is, during the Prophet ﷺ's time, there was a much simpler path to getting married, in the sense of you had individuals who were marrying from a similar community. And so because they were marrying from the similar community, there were already a lot of shared values that they understood. And there was a good understanding about what marriage entailed. Not only that, but the society of the time had a pretty rigid structure. The social structure was very well known. And so because of that, you knew what the gender roles were. You knew what the expectations of a husband were. You knew what the expectations of a wife were. Nowadays, given the society we're living in, a lot of times, even if people are marrying within their culture, there's still a huge amount of lived experience that affects individual personal values. And so you might be from the same ethnic background, but what if one person immigrated, or maybe a person lived in a different community than you? For example, I'm in the United States. In the United States, that's going to lead to different personal values. Not only that, when you think back to the Prophet ﷺ's time, people knew a lot more, I would argue, a lot more about individuals than we tend to know now. Oftentimes, the things that we get to know about people who we aren't close with or who we aren't friends with are what they decide to show on social media. And we know that that's not always true. But during the Prophet ﷺ's time, it was very common to know people based on certain qualities that they exemplified. And so for you to know someone based on that quality, it had to have been exemplified multiple times. The perfect example is the Prophet ﷺ was known as As-Sadiq al-Amin. So this wasn't just a random nickname given to him. It was given to him because he was constantly recognized as being honest, and he was constantly recognized as being trustworthy. And so those qualities were readily understood. And so because of that, it was easier for you to identify, well, who would be a good spouse for my daughter, or who would be a good spouse for my son. Let me just check. We got a question. Okay. I will look at that question, inshallah, at the end, and we can answer it then. Okay. So the different topics to discuss before getting married are expansive. There's so many different categories, but they still need to be discussed. And when you are getting to know someone, whether it was introduced through your parents, or this is something that perhaps you want to introduce this person to your parents, whatever the dynamic might be, there are some rules for discussion that you should consider. So when you're going to have these discussions about different topics before getting married, first thing you want to do is, like everything we do as Muslims, set your intention. Set your intention for this discussion. This discussion is for you to understand whether or not you and the other person are compatible, whether you guys would be a good match, whether you guys would be able to fulfill the rights of one another as husband and wife. With that intention, you have to recognize that it might mean that you need to walk away at a certain point. So part of your intention needs to be that if you recognize that this isn't working, the shared values aren't the same, or you just are not, you don't see yourself being married to this person, you have to be willing to walk away respectfully. I say this because I know that there are a lot of people that have a lot of trouble with either calling it quits, and what ends up happening is that you continue to drag this thing on and people get emotionally invested, and it ends up causing a lot of hurt. Yes, it can be hurtful to say, I'm not interested, but there is a way of going about it, and that's respectful and recognizes that, this person did invest in you in a certain amount, and you guys can just separate while being recognizing that you guys don't have anything being held against each other. Another thing to consider is to involve your parents as soon as possible. I know that looks different for different people, but involve your parents as soon as possible. Hopefully you have a relationship that's healthy with your parents, and they can offer you some guidance in the situation. And obviously they'll be able to hold you accountable so you don't get yourself into any trouble in the discussions. Not only that, but a big rule is to respect each other's privacy. Don't go around as you're having these discussions. You guys are going to get into some more sensitive topics, and sometimes this person is going to be letting you know things that they might not typically tell people, because if you are going to be their future husband or their future wife, you have the right to know certain things. But with that comes a certain level of trust. So be very mindful about respecting the person's privacy, not going out and telling your friends what this person has told you. And that should be a standard, the foundation of the conversation. Respect each other's privacy and respect each other's vulnerability. Again, there's no need to be spewing other people's business. I know sometimes it becomes this thing that's very exciting and you want to tell your friends. But again, the conversations are in a manner, and you want to know that this person is only disclosing this information to you because it's out of respect and out of trying to build a certain foundation of understanding between you two in the case that you guys end up married. Another thing is obviously be respectful. Be respectful in the conversations. You might not agree with everything that this person is or does or believes. That's okay. You guys are having a conversation to try to figure out if you're compatible. If you are not compatible, then still be respectful of the differences, even if it is so far-fetched from what you believe and what you're comfortable with. Our Prophet ﷺ taught us to demonstrate a certain level of adab in our interactions with people. And in such a vulnerable situation, you want to really zero in on that adab. The last thing that I'll say is don't hide things and don't lie. Be honest. This is a little bit of a touchy subject, but there are certain things that you should be disclosing, in the sense that if it will affect a future relationship, or it currently affects you now, and it is going to cause rifts in a marriage, that person has the right to know it. Because especially if it's something they're going to end up finding out after marriage, you not disclosing that information beforehand can be seen as dishonest, and it could really break a lot of trust in a marriage. And you don't want to be in a situation where you hid something from your spouse before marriage, they find out after marriage, and then you now are trying to figure out how are you going to maintain this relationship because your spouse no longer trusts you. It's disastrous. Now it's a touchy subject in the sense of when we get into discussing sins, past sins, the scholars, not supposed to expose our past sins. So the caveat to that is if it is, like I mentioned, going to affect your marriage or going to affect a relationship, it should be disclosed. And we'll get into some examples, particularly of what that looks like and what certain topics to look out for. Okay. So I'm going to throw out some general categories of topics that you would likely discuss with a potential spouse and what some of those questions could look like. So one topic is religiosity. So the Prophet ﷺ emphasizes this, and a common hadith known about marriage, which is if someone is pleasing to you in deen and khuluq, in religiosity and character, then marry them. If you don't, there will be corruption on earth. That's kind of the English translation of it. But religiosity is an extremely important topic to discuss. Don't just assume that someone, because they look a certain way, because they wear their hijab a certain way, or because he dresses a certain way, that he or she is religious. You need to have discussion. Letting people rate their own religiosity is a good activity and a good place to kind of understand what their reflections about their own personal iman and their practice of deen are. You can also ask about certain practices. How are you with your salah? Are you someone who's barely making your fara'id salah, or are you someone who tries to go above and beyond? You like to pray the nawafil and the sunnah. You like to pray witr. Are you someone who finds themselves is very intrigued about Islam and you try to go to lectures and halaqat and gain that knowledge in whatever way you can? Are you someone who can't be bothered with that? Are you someone who came from a really religious upbringing? Your family really invested in you when it came to the deen. Are you someone who didn't have that, or you find that a little off-putting? Whatever it is, I'm not here to say what the ideal standard is. I'm just here to say that it's important to have an honest assessment of this. The other topic to discuss is family dynamics. This is huge. There's a lot of research on understanding the way in which our family dynamics and the way we grew up affects our outlook on relationships and the quality of our relationships, as well as the way that we are going to invest in our future families and the standards we're going to hold our future families to. So ask people about that. How close are you with your family? What would you say your relationship is like with your parents? What were your parents like with each other? If you have a rough relationship with your family members, why is that? What are you doing to heal from that? What are your expectations for a future family? Are you someone who is going to be visiting your family all the time, every single weekend or every single day that you can? Or are you someone who it happens every so often, every few months? Are you someone who expects that your parents will move in with you? Whatever it is, have these discussions so you can understand the family dynamic the person has, and then you understand your family dynamic, and you can figure out a way to meld the two. Other things to discuss, and this is more broad, but expectations and roles. What do you expect from a husband? What do you expect from a wife? What are things that are non-negotiable? You're not okay with this particular duty in your mind not being taken care of by your spouse. Say these things. Don't just assume that everybody knows the rights of a wife or the rights of a husband. Say it, and so you can have the confirmation. Do you expect, for example, and this is an interesting expectation that kind of has been coming out more and more, but husbands might expect their wife to work. Again, I'm not here to say right or wrong. This is the standard. I'm just giving examples. And so have that conversation. If that's something that you are not comfortable with, well, now you have to ask the question so you can know and let the person know that you're either not comfortable with, so the standard needs to shift, or you can walk away, instead of, again, getting married and then finding that out after marriage and having issues with your trust or issues with the actual foundations of your marriage. Other things to discuss are health, nutrition, wellness. So this might seem like an interesting topic. You're not at a doctor's office, but your health is going to affect you for the rest of your life. And so whoever you're married to is going to have to know your health condition. So if you have a chronic condition, for example, that you're dealing with, that needs to be medicated and managed, that's important to disclose. If you have any hereditary conditions, that's maybe there's a high likelihood that it could be passed on to your children. That is something that your potential spouse should know. When it comes to discussions about mental health, this is extremely pertinent and very important to disclose. And maybe not immediately, maybe towards the end, if things are going well, it's a bit of a vulnerable thing to share. These health I would push to a latter part of the conversation. But it's important because, again, mental health affects your quality of life and it affects your relationships immensely. So if you are someone who struggles with certain conditions, whether you are being treated for them or not, it's important to disclose. It will disclose itself at a certain point. If you're someone who, for example, suffers with anxiety or you have a depressive disorder, at one point, it's going to bring itself up. That's just the nature of mental health issues. They expose themselves on their own. And so it's better to have that conversation first, get a sense of, is this person empathetic to these issues? Do they know what these issues are? Do they perhaps have similar issues or know people who have similar issues? And what is their willingness to be with someone who's dealing with these issues? That way, if the person doesn't have the capacity to be empathetic, they won't be able to support you in those situations, then you're able to, again, walk away and look for someone who's able to, because there's nothing more miserable than feeling alone in those situations, especially when you're locked into a nikah contract. So these are topics that are more general. Now let's get into the more shifty, more taboo, more easily overlooked topics. But these are things that, and if you're going to write anything down from today's live, write these down. Lots of topics to think about, and it's all on the table. So one question to ask is about past relationships. Specifically, has this person been married before and divorced? Now, you would assume, well, of course I would know that, right? But you would be shocked at how many people have hidden their divorce. Obviously, there's an extreme amount of taboo around the topic of a divorce. And so that might be a big reason why people hide it. There's a shame associated with it for some people. And they're afraid that if they disclose it, they might not be considered by someone they are interested in. But not disclosing this information, your future spouse is very likely to find out after you get married, and then that will corrupt the trust. So it's important to have the discussion. And if this is someone who's not interested in marrying someone who was previously divorced, that's completely okay. That's okay. You deserve to find someone who's understanding of your situation and who's willing to accept you regardless of past situations. It's also important for you, if you are the person who is not divorced, considering someone who was previously divorced, to know, why did that marriage end? That's information for you that helps you to understand, well, is it something that was more so due to the person you're speaking to? Did they work on it? How have they worked on it? Is it, so you just get a really good sense of a person's relationship quality, in a sense, by understanding their past relationships. Another topic to talk about is polygamy. Don't just assume that someone steers one way or another. Be upfront, be very straight up about it. Are you, or would you ever consider having a second or third wife, whatever it might be? Have these conversations. Don't let yourself be sidelined. At the end of the day, you can always point back to that discussion and say, well, this is something that I asked you about and I considered, and that was a big reason why I was comfortable getting married or not comfortable getting married, whatever it might be. Another thing to discuss is moving. Are you willing to move? And sometimes this is something, initially you might say, no, I'm not willing to move. And then you get married and your spouse ends up, for some reason, needing to move, really great job opportunity, or they need to be closer to family, and then things change. But initially, really consider it deeply. Are you willing to move? Are you willing to move states? Are you willing to move countries? If so, what are your limits? What continents are you looking at? So have that conversation. This is a really important topic, and I'm going to give a story associated with it. But when it comes to kids, I know someone who was married. I thought this person was extremely happily married. You could tell that this person really, really adored and loved their spouse. And I find out a few years later that this couple had divorced. And when asking about, well, what was it that happened, or I didn't ask, I should say, it was disclosed to me. I wouldn't ask someone why their marriage ended, but in discussion, it was disclosed to me that the person's spouse didn't want children. And I asked, you didn't ask this before getting married if they wanted kids? And the person said, I just assumed that everybody wanted kids. I had no idea that someone wouldn't want kids. And so this became a defining issue that ended up eventually leading to divorce, because how do you rectify that? One person wants kids, one person absolutely wants kids, one person absolutely doesn't want kids. Don't just assume everyone wants. Actually have the conversation. And you can ask, well, how many do you want? Obviously, children are a risk, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will determine how many you get. But it's just good to have the idea of, is this someone who wants a very big family? Is this someone who's used to a smaller family? Now, this is when we talked earlier about exposing sins. This is a situation where it is important because it is a health and safety issue. STD exposure, sexually transmitted disease or sexually transmitted infection exposure. If you have committed zina in the past, and I'm a PA, by the way, I'm a medical provider. I see patients, I treat these conditions very often. You might have an infection that it might not even be symptomatic. You might not be showing any symptoms with it, but you have it, and you can transmit it to your partner, and that can cause chronic issues. It is important to mention that. Do not be shy to ask someone to take an STD test. It's a very easy procedure. And just to be certain, it is not worth the risk of lying and then having to deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's consequences when you infect someone and harm them because you lied. And it is not worth the risk of contracting something. Obviously, zina is haram for a multitude of reasons, but because it transmits harm across entire societies, the way STDs are transmitted, it isn't transmitted through monogamous relationships at the possible. So please be very mindful of that. I know a story of a woman who ended up with what is called pelvic inflammatory disease because her husband had a particular STD, transmitted it to her, and it causes scar tissue on your ovaries and uterus, and she became infertile because of it. And so now she suffered such a severe consequence of no doing of her own. She wasn't the one that committed the sin, but she was lied to, and he will ultimately be held to account for that on the day of judgment. But we just want to prevent it as much as we can. And then the last topic I will mention here is infertility. If you, and not everyone knows this, sometimes it may not ever be brought up because you're not trying to have children if you're not married. But infertility is an issue that I've heard a lot of marriages failing over, not necessarily, well, sometimes because one person is infertile, but specifically a story that I'll give is that there was a gentleman who found out that he was infertile, unable to have children, and his marriage ended because of that, because his wife wanted children, and obviously wives can't, it's not like you can marry a second husband and have children. So it ended. In trying to get to know another woman, he did not disclose the fact that he was infertile for fear that she would not accept him as a potential spouse. Well, she eventually found out actually through the ex-wife, and because of that, the level of distrust she now had towards this person completely cut off all conversations. She was actually initially, she would have been willing to consider this gentleman, even though he was infertile, but because he lied about it, she just felt like she was unable to trust him. So please be very mindful of that. If you have a history of infertility in your family, if you have any conditions like PCOS or endometriosis that might make it difficult to get pregnant, it doesn't make it impossible. Sometimes it just makes it difficult. Then that's something to bring up, and you guys can explore in the future. If you guys end up getting married and having and trying for children, you can explore the medical options for treatment so that you can, inshallah, have children. Okay, so that is basically the topic I had, and I'm going to just quickly read the question that was submitted to us. So I'm going to read it just silently to myself first so I can reword it for you. All right, bismillah. So a young lady is submitting a question about there is a guy who she is interested in. They have been interested in each other for several years, but it's been difficult because of they're unsure of their future life plans to get married. She is pre-med and she's not sure what she's going to end up having to do for medical school. He's currently an engineer. They're very much interested in each other. The relationship is long distance, and they're starting to have doubts and problems because of the long distance. And she's asking, how can we talk about reforming our relationship after we are married to have a better couple life? We really love each other and want to be happy, inshallah. So a few things that I would say in response to this question. First and foremost, the plans that we have for the future, we're always going to have plans, and we never know what is going to end up happening. Ultimately, we can try our best, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might have different plans. Therefore, future plans, whether it is where you're going to end up in medical school or where you're going to be working or whatever it might be, should not prevent us from getting married. At the end of the day, when you marry, you become a couple, those plans, you guys are navigating those plans together and you'll figure out a way. And I wish I had the hadith on hand. I just recently came across it. But the Prophet it wasn't a hadith, it was a verse, but essentially the verse was explaining that when you marry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases your rizq. And Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu actually made a comment about this ayah, and he said, I don't understand how people read this ayah and don't rush to get married, right? If this is a way and means through which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase your rizq. And so erasing that doubt, and if you truly recognize that there are qualities that you want in a spouse and this person has them, and vice versa, you seek to get married, and you recognize that Islam made marriage very, very easy, very, very easy. We made it difficult because we want a huge wedding and we want it to be extravagant and we want this insane mahr. We made it difficult, but Islam made it very easy. Because Islam made it very easy, please work to get married. When you do that, just by virtue of that nikah contract, automatically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows for mawadda and rahmah, that compassionate love and that mercy to build up between you guys. So that's one part. Now, outside of that, obviously feelings of love and mercy can't carry you through a relationship. You have to work through it. Outside of that rebuilding, that connection, those doubts, that happens within a marriage. That happens through recognizing and being able to see firsthand the person's flaws and how they rectify them. That happens through making and navigating big life decisions together. That happens through noticing these different moments in your day where you can demonstrate respect to the other person, or you can demonstrate love to the other person, and you're having this opportunity to really build a friendship. You guys are physically together more. You're living in the same home, and because of that, you're able to you have a greater opportunity to build such an intimate relationship outside of just what we think about when it comes to intimacy, but truly intimate, and that you trust each other and you feel comfortable talking with each other and you want to be around each other. All of that, there are lots of really great resources. If you follow me at Salim Life Coaching on Instagram, SALIM Life Coaching, I have a lot of posts on premarital or marital tips and relationship advice, and so you are more than welcome to also look at that. But that reforming your relationship, it's not necessarily a reforming, because marriage is completely different. Marriage is a relationship unlike anything prior to getting married. Even the problems that you guys are noticing are nothing compared to the problems that can come about in marriage, because it's such a vulnerable and intimate relationship. And so it leads to a magnification of both the best parts of us, but also the worst parts of us. And so having that commitment there, that marriage there, that commitment is going to help you guys to navigate it further. So again, just to repeat, my advice is actually seek to get married regardless of what your life plans might be. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it very easy for a reason. And it's us who create the excuses. So really work on that. If you can get that settled and hold off on the worries, then once you guys are married, you can actually do the work to build a very healthy, solid foundation that's built on getting to know each other more deeply. That's built on trusting each other, being respectful towards each other, speaking each other's love languages. If you're not sure what love languages are, Google it and you'll find the website, and read the book, please, The 5 Love Languages. It's extremely helpful in marriages. It was actually written by a psychologist who was doing couples counseling. You can, just figure out what shared activities you enjoy doing together. You guys will have a better idea when you're married of what it is that makes this other person tick, and what you kind of have to navigate more easily, and how to make that person feel comforted when they're overwhelmed or they're angry or they're emotional about things. And so all of that happens after marriage. There's only so much you can do before marriage without getting into a dangerous territory Islamically, right? Without stepping into sin. So that is the question. That is my answer to that question. I hope inshallah was helpful. I hope everything that was spoken here today is of some use to you guys. I hope inshallah you guys are now able to better navigate discussions before marriage, and it is something that just makes it a lot easier. I know it's very scary, it's very difficult. By the way, you can, if you are not able to ask these questions, you can have your parents ask them for you and get those answers. You can, if you need to have them record it for you, if the dynamic is a little more strict in your family, then do that too. If you need, you have your wadi next to you as you're asking these questions, that's fine too. Allow for whatever way you're able to have the discussions and just get a good understanding of the other person. And so far as you're able to prior to marriage. All right. And we will end here. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And thank you for tuning in.